Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk about creating the kinds of always changing, wonderfully messy cities and towns that we humans clearly love. We'll talk with those people trying to revive them or create them anew, whether they be designers, developers, builders, planners, or just anyone interested in the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. I'm happy today to be joined by my friend and fellow new urbanist, longtime participant, Frank Starkey, joining us from Florida. Frank, how you doing today?
Howdy, Kevin. Doing great. Happy to be with you.
I didn't even check. I assume you're in Florida at home, but you could be
I am.
anywhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. We recently moved into a townhouse that Andy Mikulski, who used to work for me, built in town here. And we just bought one and we're very happy here. It's really nice.
Cool. And you're in Port Richey?
Yes. Port Richey is on the northwest side of the Tampa Bay region. It's part of the region. We're in that suburban sprawl miasma that characterizes all Florida cities. And we're about 25 miles as the crow flies from Tampa, basically from downtown Tampa, and probably 15 to 20 miles from Clearwater and 30 miles from St. Pete. So we're right on the Gulf. We have a river that runs right through town that river miles from where we are out to the Gulf is maybe 5 river miles. So you could easily kayak and paddleboard right out there, or upstream pretty quickly you're into the Cypress freshwater wetlands. So we've got a lot of good nature around us.
Do you ever do that? Do you ever get out on a kayak or whatever and get out there?
Yeah, it's been a while. But if you go up to, there's a preserve that the city owns that's up in the freshwater area. And if you're in there, you think you're in, a lot of the Tarzan movies and shows were filmed in Florida swamps, and you feel like you're in a Tarzan movie. You can't see that you're in the middle of town. And if you go out to the coast, the barrier islands end right where we are. They really start and go south from here. So from here on up through the Big Bend of the Panhandle in Florida, the coastline is all marshes and salt flats and grass wetlands. It's a much prettier coastline, in my opinion, than the more built-up barrier islands. So, but you can go out and kayak for days and days out in the coastal areas and see all kinds of wildlife and water life. So it's pretty cool.
That's cool. That's really cool. Well, Frank and I have been talking about trying to do this for a while. We'd hoped to hook up in Cincinnati, but schedules just got in the way, as is typical for that event. But I really wanted to talk with you today, Frank, because you kind of hit on a couple of my hot points, which is that you're an architect and a developer. And I know as a designer that you also care a lot about the kind of issues that we talk about routinely within the world of new urbanism and urban design, which is, creating beautiful walkable places. So I just think it'd be interesting. I talk to a lot of people who come into the world of trying to be developers. You and I probably both talk to a lot of fellow architects who we try to encourage to be developers. And it's fascinating to me how people come to that. So I wonder if we could start just a little bit by talking about like your path, and where, how you got to this point. Did you grow up in Florida, or were you in Texas? Is that right?
No, I grew up in Florida. I went to college in Texas, but I grew up on a cattle ranch just east of here, in an area that's now it's called Odessa. It was a 16,000 acre beef cattle ranch that our grandfather had bought in the 1930s.
Hmm.
And we were about 20 miles from downtown Tampa, and Newport Richey was our hometown because of the county. We're in Pasco County. And so we came to, church, school, shopping was in Newport Richey. But I also kind of had an orientation towards Tampa because we were sort of closer that direction. And then my extended family all lived in St. Petersburg. My parents had grown up there, and then my dad grew up in Largo on a ranch down there that his dad had before the one in Odessa.
So it's like the rare species of old Florida people, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but man, I have a weird, I've always come from a very mixed, just a very mutt kind of background, culturally, geographically, economically. My great grandparents were mostly from the upper Midwest. And so and my great grandfather on my dad's side was William Straub, who was the publisher of the St. Petersburg Times. But I later found out that he was instrumental in getting the city to hire John Nolan to do a plan for the remainder of St. Petersburg. He was instrumental in getting the city to buy up a mile of its waterfront to create a continuous waterfront park along the bay in downtown St. Petersburg, which is the crown jewel of the city in terms of civic space. So I kind of grew up, and then that kind of orientation towards parks. He also helped the Pinellas County, establish a park system, which was one of the earliest ones in the country. And so this park orientation and public space and civic life and civic engagement was a strain through my whole childhood. It was kind of a generational thing in our family. And so that's one thread. And living in the country, we didn't have much in the way of neighbors. The area of Odessa in those days was pretty poor. So that I rode the school bus with kids that, had virtually nothing, and went to school in the suburbs of Western Pasco, which was, where the kids were mostly from the Midwest. Their grandparents had worked for Ford or GM or Chrysler, and then they moved to Florida, and their grandkids, their kids moved with them. And so those were the kids I grew up with. And so I didn't feel like I grew up in the deep South. But I was close enough to it that I understand it, but I don't consider myself a, capital S Southerner, my accent notwithstanding, to the degree that a good friend of mine grew up in Plant City on the east side of Tampa, which is much more in the farming rural part of Hillsborough County. And he was much more deep South than I was, even though we grew up, 40 miles apart. So just a very different cultural setting. So I grew up with, upper Midwest heritage who had been in St. Petersburg since 1899. And then, poor kids, middle-class kids, and then, eventually wealthier folks. So I just kind of had this really all over the place cultural background. That's not nearly as simple as, all of Florida is a tapestry of a patchwork of different kinds of cultural influences. South of I-10, north of I-10, you're in South Georgia or Alabama, but the peninsula of Florida is very culturally mixed up.
So the old canard, I guess, was that the west coast of Florida was populated by people who came from the Midwest, and the East Coast was from the Northeast. Does that hold true in your experience?
Yeah, that does hold true. Although there were a lot of New Yorkers and Boston, not so much New England, but still a lot of New Yorkers found their way across. So I grew up around a lot of New York Italian descent folks, as well as Midwesterners. So it's a wonder I don't have a New York accent or a Michigan accent or a Southern accent, because those were the kind of the three more Northern accents than Southern accents from immediately where I grew up. But yeah, I-75 goes to Detroit, and that I-95 on the East Coast goes to New York, and that means that has an impact.
Did you ever know about the Kansas City connection to St. Pete then with J.C. Nichols down there in downtown St. Pete?
Tell me about it. I mean,
Well,
because Bruce Stevenson's book, I think, touched on that because they had an APA convention down here back in the 1920s.
Yeah, J.C. Nichols, who developed the Country Club Plaza here,
right.
starting really in the 19-teens. Later in his life, he was asked to, or he bought property in St. Petersburg, in or near the downtown area, and the whole concept was they were going to essentially build like another version of Country Club Plaza there in downtown
Really?
St. Pete. Yeah, and so I think like a small portion of it got built down there, and then maybe the real estate deal fell apart or something like that. But there was, that was a big
the Depression hit.
push at some point. Yeah.
Interesting. No, I wasn't aware of that. I didn't know that he had bought and had plans to develop here. That's interesting.
Yeah.
The St. Petersburg's, the Florida land bust was in 1926. So Florida real estate speculation was really ended then, and then it didn't pick up again until after World War II.
Yeah.
So that might have been the death of it.
So you find yourself growing up on a ranch, then, pretty much in Florida. What takes you to architecture? Like, what takes you to architecture, and then to Texas to go to architecture school?
For whatever combination of reasons, one evening when I was in about fourth grade, Dad recollected this years later. I asked Dad at the dinner table, what do you call a person? What do you call a person who designs buildings? Not as a riddle, just. Yeah. And he said, it's called an architect. And I said, well, that's what I want to be when I grow up. And I never had the sense to question that decision again.
It sounds vaguely familiar.
So, whether it was Legos and Lincoln Logs and the Brady Bunch, and when I was a kid, we had a cabin in North Carolina that Dad had the shell built by this guy who had a lumber mill up there, and he would build a shell for you for $5,000 or something. He built that out of green poplar wood. The whole thing was immediately warped and racked and sagged and did everything that green wood will do if you immediately put it in a building. But Dad spent all of our vacation times up there finishing out the interior of that. So I was just around that kind of construction. And Dad was also, being a cattle rancher, and he knew welding, and he was always tinkering, and in addition to fixing things, he was also inventing implements to use on the ranch and things like that. So he just had a hand building ethic that he just kind of had. So whatever made me decide I wanted to design buildings, as I grew up from that point on, I just was all about it. And so by the time I got to high school, I couldn't wait to get into working for an architect. And so I interned for an architect in Port Richey when I was in high school. And then I went to Rice University in Houston to go to architecture school. So after I did my internship year, which is part of the program at Rice for the professional degree. I did that in New York City for Pay Cobb Freed and Partners. And another ironic thing was I had a really great classical architecture history professor in college at Rice, who in his summers he and his partner, who was a art history professor also, of fine arts. They led an archaeological excavation outside Rome of a villa that basically dated a time period of about 600 years, straddling the time of Christ. And I spent the summer after my freshman year on that dig. So I had a really strong exposure to classical architecture and urbanism throughout my school. And when I worked for Pay, I worked on James Freed's projects. At that time, we were working on what became the Ronald Reagan building in Washington, D.C. It's the last big building in the Federal Triangle. And so it's a neoclassical exterior with a very modern interior. It's kind of like a spaceship wrapped inside a federal building. And the other project I worked on a little bit that year was the San Francisco Main Library, which is in the Civic Center, right down in the Civic Center of San Francisco, where the City Hall and the old library. The new library is a mirror of it. That's a neoclassical facade on, well, two wings of a neoclassical facade that face the Civic Center side, and then on the back side, which faces Market Street, it's a much more modern interpretation of that commercial core district facing along Market Street. So I worked on these buildings with that took, this was at the end of the POMO era of the 80s, when everybody was making fun of classical architecture, architects were having fun with it or making fun of it, however you look at it. And Fried was taking it more seriously. It was still a updated take on neoclassical architecture in some of the details, but it was really a fascinating exposure to the actual practice of designing classical buildings, working for one of the most famously modernist firms in the world.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Yeah. That's pretty wild. Was Rice, I mean, we're about the same age. Was Rice kind of like most architecture schools, generally speaking, in their emphasis on, looking at modernist design as the holy grail that you must pursue?
Yeah. Interestingly, like my childhood and the cultural mix that I was described earlier, Rice was sort of in this period at that time where it was between deans. There was a series of it's too long a story to explain here, but the previous dean, who had been there for 15 years or something, Jack Mitchell, announced his retirement the day I started classes. And so he was a lame duck. And then it was, we basically went through a series of searches. Dean passed away, interim dean, search, a new dean, and then he resigned. So the whole time I was at college, we really didn't have a dean. And the faculty that Mitchell had built was very, I'd say, ecumenical. We had some diehard theoretical postmodernists, and we had, at the other end of the spectrum, we had a guy who did a lot of real estate development who was super practical, and we always made fun of him for caring about mundane things like budgets.
Well,
and
yeah, exactly.
I know I made him a laughing stock, which I wish I'd taken more of his classes. But anyway, and then a really good core faculty who had a real sense of and real care about urban design. And my sophomore class field trip was to Paris, and we did studies of, in groups, each of us studied an urban plus. So I really had a strong urban design and contextual sensibility through my architecture class, all my architecture classes. In the background, there was this whole drumbeat of postmodernist, post-structuralism and deconstructivism that was going on. I never cottoned to that. It always just seemed like anything that requires that much intellectual gymnastics is probably just kind of bullshit. And also, I was involved with campus ministries and Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and church, and so I had a sense of mission and doing well doing good in the world. And it also just didn't work with that either. So I didn't really go in for that stuff, but the urban design stuff really did stick with me. And then the classical architecture and Vignoli, which I mentioned to you the other day, that really did kind of stick to me as a methodology.
And man, I went for it hook, line, and sinker, man.
Really?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I thought deconstructivism was like the coolest thing at that time period, and I bought the whole program for some period of time, and frankly, until I ran across some of Andreas's writings, and then started like learning about Seaside, and that's really what kind of broke it open for me, that I started see things a little bit differently and all. But I was in deconstructivism was funny because you could just kind of do anything,
Yeah.
and you could call anything a building basically.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. The author is dead. Long live the text.
yeah.
Was the, and so you could just, yeah. And to me, it was just pulling butt stuff out of your butt. And
Oh,
I just,
totally. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was all bullshit, but it
yeah.
was,
Yeah.
it was, I guess, fun for a 19 or 20-year-old for a little
Yeah.
while. So, so all right. So, fast forward then, did you come back to Florida then pretty much right after school or yeah?
Yeah. I did a gap year after college and then ended up in Austin for another year and then came back to work with my brother. So by that time, we had seen, because of where the ranch is situated, it's sort of in the crosshairs of growth patterns coming from Tampa to the south and Clearwater to the southwest and Newport Richey from the west. So it was, the growth was coming at us from two directions.
Hmm.
Granddad, and this 16,000 acres that's 20 miles from downtown Tampa, as you can imagine, in the 20th century, is going up in value pretty dramatically from 1937 to to the late century. And in the early 70s, he started selling and donating land to the state for preservation. And so we had, again, that whole park ethic. And so we were selling, kind of selling the northern parts that were away from the development pattern off. And it was partly for estate tax planning purposes and also but primarily to put the land into conservation so there would be something left of native Florida for people to see in future generations. That was his goal. My brother is 6 years older than me and had gone to University of Florida and gotten a finance degree. And then he came back after college, which was when I was like my senior year in high school, and started working for Granddad was still alive and he was working for the estate, helping with that planning. Then Granddad passed away while I was in college and we had the estate tax to deal with. And we ended up selling some more land to the state for conservation. And he also started learning the development process. We knew that as much land as we could sell to the state as possible, we were not going to be able to sell it all, and we were going to have to somebody was going to develop land on the ranch. And our family wanted to see that it was done in a way that was, that we would be proud of, that put together our family goals for civic engagement, environmental preservation, and also it was the whole family's sole asset. So it's everybody's retirement fund, and principally our parents and our cousins. So we have cousins who are half generation older than us. So we were accepting that development was inevitable and wanted to be more in control of it. So Trey had been talking to me for a while about coming back and working with him on the development stuff on the ranch. So that's what I decided to do in 1995. And the decision point for me was, I had set up my career trajectory to become a consulting architect and design buildings for other people. And I realized that I had this opportunity to, have a bigger imprint on developing a neighborhood that could perhaps set a pattern. By that time, I had become knowledgeable about new urbanism and what was going on at Seaside. And at that point, I think some of the other projects were starting to come out of the ground. So this is 1995. Mm-hmm. So I was like, well, I've got too much opportunity here, and with what I know and what I have to bring to the table, it just seems like the thing I need to do. So I came back and we started working on development on the southwestern corner of the ranch, which was sort of the direction that was the front line for development. So in 1997, we held our charrette for what became Longleaf, which is a 568-acre traditional neighborhood development that we broke ground on in 1999. Our first residents moved in 2000. And that was the first T&D in Pasco County. and in my opinion was the last T&D in Pasco County, because the county loved it so much that they passed a T&D standards ordinance, which it would never comply with, and that no other developers ever wanted to do, and so nobody really has. They've kind of just, it's been compromised left and right. That's a whole other story.
Well, it sounds that, I mean, we may need to get into that at some point, but
okay.
So you started this in 2000 and really in earnest 2001 or so, and obviously there was a little bump in the economy right then, but I guess kind of more of a bump compared to what came later.
Yeah.
So talk about like maybe that first decade then, like what all did you build, and how much of this were you actively involved in the design of?
It's fascinating looking back on it, how compressed that time frame was, because we developed the first of 4 neighborhoods. In the first neighborhood we did in, as I said, 99, 2000. And then we built the second neighborhood in 2002, 2003. We sold the third and fourth neighborhoods in 2004, which, 6 years later, we look like geniuses. If we'd been real geniuses, we would have waited until 2006 to sell them. But we got out before the crash, obviously, so we did well there. Trey and I, because we had a view of building a career in real estate development, we thought we should do everything. We should touch every aspect of the process ourselves at least once, so we knew how everything worked. But then we never scaled up our operation big enough to hire people to fill in those specialties for us. So we really both kind of ended up doing a whole lot of the work ourselves. So our our designer was Jeffrey Farrell, who did the overall plan for Longleaf, and he wrote the design code, and but we collaborated on all that very closely, because I knew enough about what New Urbanism was and architecture, and so I administered that design code with our builders. He detailed out the first neighborhood. He and I detailed out the second neighborhood collaboratively. It was sort of a 50-50. And you know what I mean by detailed out? Just, when you take a schematic plan and then you have to put it into CAD and get it to real dimensions and deal with wetland lines and drainage and all that stuff. You get shit gets real about curbs and things like that. So that kind of those details. And the third neighborhood I detailed out, but we sold it. But the developer who bought it built it out according to what I had done. So I was very involved with the planning side of it, and of course I had been involved with the entitlements. And then I administered the design code with all of our builders. So I was dealing with and we didn't have sophisticated builders. We didn't have we weren't a custom home builder project. We were small local production builders. So these were builders who built 300 houses a year. We weren't dealing with David Weekley, a national home builder who was doing nice stuff, nor were we dealing with the 12 unit a year custom builders. So we didn't have much sophistication on the design side coming from our builders. So I did a lot of hand holding on the design of that. I always tell, if you're an architect who's going to develop a T&D, I will tell you, under no circumstances do what I did. Always hire somebody else to be the bad guy, because as the developer, you can't look the home builder in the eye and say, let this customer go.
Yeah.
And so even though they're asking you to do something you shouldn't, so you need somebody who can be your heavy for that. And it's not going to be you as the developer. But anyway, I did that, and then I designed some of the common buildings and then had them. I wasn't licensed yet, and so I had those CDs done by somebody with a stamp. So I always said that between the larger planning of the ranch and the strategy there. And I also got involved in community, regional and county-wide planning efforts and committees and things like that, and planning council. So I kind of worked at the scale from the region to the doorknob, and which is fabulous as an architect, because I've found all of those levels. I still do. I find all of those levels of design and planning fascinating.
So let's talk about the mechanics of like being a land developer for a minute, and how you did it. So you obviously own the land, and then you came up with a master plan. So then, how many steps did you take? You took on the burden of entitling probably the whole project and phase by phase, and then were you also financing and building infrastructure as well, and then basically selling off finished parcels or finished lots to other developers or builders?
Yeah, so Dad owned the land free and clear. He contracted the land to us under a purchase and sale agreement whereby we would pay a release price when we sold a lot. Okay. So, it's favorable, inside family deal. We paid him a fair price, but it was a very favorable structure that allowed it, and he subordinated it to lending for. We had to borrow. We don't have cash as a family. None of us have cash flow from. We don't have some other operating company that spits off cash flow. So we had asset value but no cash flow. So we had to borrow money to pay for infrastructure. For planning and entitlement costs and engineering. And so that was our first loan. And then we set up a community development district, which is a special purpose taxing district that a lot of states have different versions of them. In Florida, it's called a CDD. It's basically like a quasi municipality that a developer can establish with permission from the county and state government to establish a district, which is then able to sell tax-free government-style bonds to finance infrastructure. So it's an expensive entity to create and then to maintain. But if you're financing a big enough chunk, which in those days was like $10 million, it became efficient to have the care and feeding of the district in order to get the cheaper money. So you could get cheaper bond money for financing infrastructure. You could not finance marketing or specific lot specific things. You could, for example, you could finance drainage, but you couldn't finance fill. So some of the terminology was a little bit, you kind of had to do some creative workarounds. But basically, it also meant you had to still have a source of capital for those things that the district would not finance. So we had an outside loan structure in addition to the CDD financing. And that was how we financed the construction of the development, and then sold the lots to individual home builders. We had 3 builders under contract in our first phase, and each of them was committed to a certain number of lots. And they had enough capital access on their own to finance the construction of their houses. A lot of them would use their buyers' financing and do construction permanent loans to finance the vertical construction of the houses. But the builders had the ability to take down the lots. So that was the deal. I don't know if that structure is still done very much, or if there were many builders in that scale that still do that. In Florida, or in this area, it seems like most of those builders got just crushed in the Great Recession and never came back. I'm not really aware of any builders that are in that scale, in that size range anymore. I mean, if there are, there's maybe a dozen where there used to be 100.
Yeah. So they either got smaller or a lot bigger, basically.
No, they mostly just flat got killed and just went out of business. And they may have resurrected themselves. Yeah, they may have resurrected as smaller, or gone to work for somebody else or retired because a lot of them were older.
Hmm.
Of the builders that we had, yeah, I think they probably did get smaller in fairness, but they were gone, and we were out of, as I said earlier, we were long out of Longleaf, and the Crosland was the developer that bought the third and fourth neighborhoods, and they brought in all new builders, so they brought in David Weekley and Inland, which was a larger regional builder, and then Morrison, I think, one of the other larger builders who did rear-loaded T&D product.
So how much heartburn was that for you and your family to go from this position where you're like asset rich but cash poor to it, and then all of a sudden you're taking on pretty large debt to do this development piece? I mean, what was that like?
Well, it's you don't know what you don't know when you're young and ambitious. So it was there were some real Rolaids chewing moments. I think, as I recall, the most stressful times for us were before we started construction. And it was frankly, it was harder on Trey because he was starting a family at that time. So he had literally more mouths to feed than I did. I was still single, and I didn't have the stresses on me that he did. And once we got under development, we weren't so much, the stress level shifted to different, kind of a different complexion. And fortunately, when the recession hit, we were done with we didn't have, we weren't sitting with Longleaf hanging on us. So that was good. But we were in the midst of entitlements for the Starkey Ranch project, which was the remainder of the land that the family still had that had not been sold to the state. And we were taking that, it was about 2,500 acres. We were taking that through entitlements starting in 2005. And I would say that we got our entitlements, not our zoning, but we got our entitlements package approved in essence the day before the recession hit. So, we had borrowed a lot of money relatively, a lot more money to pay for that. And that also involved the whole family, because that was the rest of the ranch that the part that Longleaf is on, Dad had owned individually, free and clear. The remainder of it had been in Granddad's estate, and that went down to children and grandchildren. And so there were 7 different owners of that. And we had spent some time in the early 2000s putting that together into a partnership, into one joint venture, where everybody owned a pro rata share of the whole. But we had other shareholders to answer to. And so that was a whole other level of stress due to the recession, because our bank did what all banks do, and they called the loan even though we hadn't defaulted. We would have defaulted if they'd waited 6 months, but they blinked first and they sued us, and we spanked them in essence. But we at the end of the day, but it was 2 years of grinding through a lawsuit that was hideous, and that was really the most unpleasant level of stress. Not because we were going to lose our houses, but because it was acrimonious and not what we wanted to be doing. Plus, you had the background of the whole world having ground to a halt. So fighting that out through the dark days of the recession was, that was pretty lousy way to spend a couple of years. Yeah.
So then how did you all come out of that situation then?
We ended in a settlement. The worst part of the settlement to me was that we had to, long story, but we had retained ownership of downtown Longleaf with, the commercial core, mixed use core of Longleaf. And that wasn't completed development yet. And because we had that collateralized on another loan with the same bank, we ended up having to cut that off as part of the settlement. So we amputated a finger, not a hand, but still it was our pointer finger. So that was hard, but but we lived to fight another day, which again, fortunately, it's better to be lucky than good, right? That makes us look like, we did pretty well coming out of the recession. So after the recession and after getting that settled out, and there was a couple of other small pieces of land that we had collateralized to the bank that we, handed over, but basically got them to walk away from pursuing us further. We got that worked out, and then we had to then figure out how to sell the land. Our joint venture partner, which was to have been Crosland on the remainder on developing the ranch, they had gone to pieces during the recession, so they weren't there anymore. And the only buyers at those coming out of that were big hedge funds and equity funds. And their only buyers were national home builders. And the national home builders, even the ones like Pulte, who had tiptoed into traditional neighborhood development product before the recession, they were like, nope, backing up, never doing that again.
Yeah.
So everything that we had about T&D and our entitlements, they're like, get that shit out of there. T&D is a 4-letter word. We will not do that. So we kind of de-entitled a lot of our entitlements and cut it back to just a rudimentary neighborhood structure and interconnected streets and some mix of uses, and negotiated to sell it to one of these hedge funds and or investment funds who developed it with a merchant developer and sold it to national home builders. And they pretty quickly undid what was left of our neighborhood structure and developed it in a pretty conventional fashion. They did a really nice job on it, and it sold at a premium to everything around it. They did a really great job with their common area landscaping, but they gutted the town center. They didn't even do a good strip center in lieu of it. They just did a freestanding Publix and a bunch of out parcel pieces. They squandered any opportunity to create a real there out of the commercial areas. They did beautiful parks and trails and amenity centers, but they just didn't get doing a commercial town center.
What years was that when they developed that piece?
We sold it to them in 2012, and I guess they started construction in 13 or so, and it was really selling out through 2020. Yeah. They still got some commercial that they're building on. I don't know if they've got any residential that I mean, its peak was in the 17, 18, 19 range, and it was one of the top projects in the country and certainly in the Bay Area, and got a lot of awards. And yeah, so I can't complain too much about it because it sounds like sour grapes, but basically they didn't. I always just tell people I'll take neither blame nor credit for what they did, because it's just not at all what we. Right. There's very little of it that is what we laid out. So we having sold that in 2012, that left me and Trey to go do what we wanted to do. All of the rest of the family for that matter. And Trey was ready to hang it up on development for a while, so he kept a piece out of the ranch entitlements and started the blueberry farm. And I went and decided to do in-town small scale development. Ultimately ended up in Port Richey, back in my own hometown. And then and that's what I've been doing since 2015.
Yeah. So I'm curious about a couple of things. So with the completion of the sale of all that and the development of both Longleaf and Starkey Ranch, I guess I'm curious how your family felt about the results of all those. Were people happy, not happy with the results? Was there, I'm just kind of curious about that dynamic, because it's an interesting thing with a family property. And then I guess secondly, with you being somebody who carried more a certain set of ideals for development, like what did you take away from that whole process, especially with Starkey Ranch, and any useful lessons like for the future or for others relative to an experience like that?
couple of couple of thoughts. As far as the whole family goes, we were our cousins don't live here, and they were less engaged in it intellectually and just personally. The four of us kids had grown up here, and this was our backyard. They had grown up in St. Pete, and one of them lived in North Georgia, and so they just weren't as emotionally invested in it. Not to say they didn't care, but it wasn't their backyard that had been developed.
Right.
And and we all are proud that 3/4 of the ranch, of the 16,000 acres, over 13, almost 13,000 of it is in conservation land that will always be the way it was when we were kids. Except there are no fences, which is very disorienting. But anyway, it's still, that's the way Granddad saw it when he was young, and it will always be that way. So we're all excited about that, and we pay attention to that more than we do to what happened on the development. I think even Longleaf. The the people in the surrounding area think we're sellouts, and people who have lived here for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years are still just shocked and dismayed by the rapid pace of development. Well, there's a rapid pace of development, but we've been seeing it coming for 130 years now as a family. And it's why we put land into conservation going back to the early 70s when Granddad started selling that. What people can see is the part along State Road 54, which is the visible stuff, which 10 years ago was a lot of pastures with long views and pleasant looking cattle, who were a money losing proposition as a agricultural business. But people don't see that. They just thought, oh, it's pretty pasture land, and how can you turn that into houses? It's so you greedy bastards.
Yeah.
So we get a lot of flack still to this day. And I've got Trey's wife is a county commissioner, and she gets all kinds of grief for being corrupt, because people see our names on everything and they're like, well, they must be corrupt. No, you've never met any less corrupt people. And but so there's kind of public blowback to it. I've said what I've said, what I just told you about the how the development of the ranch did not comport with what we envisioned for it. And I don't shy away from saying that. I don't go around banging a drum about it. Because what's the point of that? And a lot of people might think I just sound like sour grapes, but I think we all had our ugly cry about the ranch at some point. I remember when the first closings of the ranch were in 2012, and it was a phased takedown that they take a chunk at a time. So we stayed in our office, which was the house that we had grown up in at the ranch headquarters, right where the cattle pens and the horse barn, the truck barn, and the shop, and all of the all the ranch operations were. And the day that when eventually we had to move everything out, and almost all of it got torn down. I remember I went out and stood by a tree and cried my face off for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It still chokes me up to think about it. And we all did that. But it wasn't an overnight thing to us. Whereas if you lived in a subdivision in the area that, by the way, had been a cattle ranch 20 years ago, you're not living on land that was settled by, the colonists. It seemed shockingly fast, just like overnight. Oh my God! All of a sudden, they're scraping the grass off of that, and 3 weeks later, there's houses going up. It's just shocking and really disorienting. We had seen it coming literally our whole lives. We always knew that was going to be the case. So there was going to be something there. Our feelings about what it was compared to what we would like it to have been are another. That's what we have to wrestle with. But the fact that it's developed, we always saw that coming, and people don't really understand that because it's perceived so differently if you just drive by and see it developed one day when it wasn't, than if you grow up with an aerial photograph on the wall of Dad's office, and we just know that that's not always going to be that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk for a minute about what you're doing now then with the stuff in New Port Richey and the smaller scale infill stuff. What was like the first one after shifting gears and doing that? What was like the first project you took on your own?
Much more fun topic. Thank you for shifting gears. I should have let you do that sooner. So Newport Richey is a pre-war town that was laid out in 1911 by Wayne Stiles, who I'm starting to learn more about. Was a pretty cool town, kind of B-list town planner who worked with people like John Nolan and the Olmsted brothers and was contemporary to them. Got a very competent little city plan for a small town, and it has building stock in the Main Street and Grand Boulevard downtown that dates to the 1920s and to the 1950s and 60s, kind of about half and half. And so it always had these good urban bones, some decent building stock, nothing great. It was never a wealthy town, so it doesn't have big grand Victorian houses down a boulevard or anything, but it's got some good characteristics. But it had economically just cratered over, just for years and really decades of disinvestment, moving out to the suburbs. It wasn't white flight in the traditional sense, but it was economically, it was the same, just reallocation of wealth from the historic city into the suburbs and leaving the city behind. So in 2015, there was downtown Newport Richey has a little lake, about a 5-acre, really lovely little city park, a riverfront, and the central business district is right next to it. And then there's a pink Mediterranean Revival hotel building from 1926 right in that park that kind of ties it all together. It's all the same ingredients that downtown St. Petersburg has, just in miniature and in bad shape. And St. Petersburg, believe it or not, which is now the best city in Florida, was really down at heels for most of my childhood. The Vinoy Hotel, which is their big pink hotel, was a hulking, it looked like something out of Detroit when I was a kid, broken out windows and chain link fence around it and weeds, and looked like a haunted hotel. So the hacienda was kind of in that shape almost. And downtown was just kind of sitting there with some honky tonk bars and a lot of, just kind of moribund commercial space. The city had bought out the First Baptist Church, which overlooked that lake right downtown, when the church decamped out to the suburbs, like all the other capital in town, and even God's capital moved out to the suburbs. And the city bought it and tore down the church buildings and put a for sale sign on it, put it out for RFP a couple of times, got crickets in response, because no self-respecting developer would look at downtown Newport Richey as a place to develop. And I looked at it, and as Robert Davis and Andres Duani will point out, we developers and architects and urbanists, we live in the future. Our brains are in what can be, not what is here now. And you've heard Andres say that the present is the distortion field. Yeah. So I wasn't bothered by the fact that the neighborhoods around it weren't the greatest neighborhoods. They weren't terrible. And I looked at it and said, well, this is a pretty kick-ass piece of property. You're overlooking this nice lake. There's a park. There's a downtown right there. We can work with this. So I asked the city to put it out for an RFQ, which they did. And Eric Brown, your buddy and mine, and one of your former guests on the podcast recently, was the architect for the buildings, and Mike Watkins, whom you also know, was the planner. I had them come in and do a charrette to develop a design for an apartment project on that former church property. And we negotiated a deal with the city to buy that property, and we were off and running. So that was the first project. Just announcing that and showing, some people were rightly skeptical that it would just end up being another low-income housing thing, because this is Newport Richey. It's an economic shithole. Why would anybody put anything nice here? And surely, even if you think it's going to be, um, luxury, or if you're just saying it, it's obviously just going to, there's no way it can end up being anything but low income housing. And, but a lot of other people were excited to see that somebody was putting some investment in town. And it just kind of started to change people's thinking. Then we took on a commercial building downtown that when I was a kid had been a IGA grocery store where we did our grocery shopping. And it had fallen into, another moribund state as an antique mall that just needed to be fixed up and refreshed and enlivened up with something new. So we bought that and did a severe gut job on it, divided it up into 5 tenant spaces, brought in a natural grocery store that was in town, but in a much terrible location, and a new microbrewery, the first microbrewery in town, and a taco place, and a kayak paddleboard outfitter, and a CrossFit gym. Kind of a dream lineup of
it's like
revitalizing. Yeah. The kayak place didn't last very long. They were pretty ahead of the market, and also just it wasn't their core business. They just didn't really know how to do it right. And then the taco place ended up getting replaced. The CrossFit gym outgrew the box and went to a much bigger location. And then we replaced them with an axe throwing business, which is killing it. So no joke, no pun intended. And then the microbrewery is still there. The natural food store is still there. And then in the paddleboarding space, we now have a craft market that is multiple vendors that are, like cottage industry makers selling under one roof. And we have a new bar and hamburger place in the former taco place, and they're also doing really well. And so between those two projects, it really, and then, it's other businesses started opening, new businesses opened downtown that just kind of had a new approach. They weren't honky tonks. They weren't just kind of appealing to a kind of a has-been demographic. And that just started changing the attitude. And the most remarkable occurrence was at one point, and this was around 2018, I just noticed that the online chatter and the general discussion among locals about Newport Richey kind of flipped from overwhelmingly negative, people just running down the town, just saying this place is terrible, get out while you can. There's nothing but crackheads and prostitutes, and it's just terrible. And to, hey, this place is pretty cool. It's getting better. It's got a lot of potential. And the naysayers started getting shouted down by the people who were more optimistic and positive about the town. And it just kind of hit that Malcolm Gladwell tipping point pretty quickly. And the attitude of the town and the self-image of people in town just has been significantly different ever since then. And then that's of course paid dividends and more investment coming to downtown. Now you can't find a place to rent for retail downtown. We actually have the problem now that there's too much food and beverage, and the market isn't growing enough because we've got to bring in customers from outside of the immediate area because it's just not densely populated enough town yet. But that's kind of where things started in Newport Richey.
That's a great story. It's so indicative of also like what Monty Anderson has talked about. Let's sort of like finding your farm and a place that you care about and working there and making it better. And that's really cool.
Yeah.
When it came to all this, were you self-financing? Were you working with investors? How was that process?
On the Central, which is our apartments, and on the 5800 Main, which is the project that had been the IGA store, I have a financial partner on that, who's another local who had, done well for himself in banking, and lived away and moved back and was wanting to invest, but also to invest locally in a way that helps, give something back to his hometown, and that was my attitude as well. So our capital has been him and me on those two projects, and then I've got two other buildings that one other building that I have a co-owner on, and then another building I own solely by myself. So I've got a total of 4 projects, and all of the projects that I have are within 1, 2, 3 blocks of 4 blocks of each other. Uh-huh. I was, you mentioned the farm. I was very intentional about farm. I said, okay, my farm is Newport Richey, my farmyard is downtown, and my barn is our office, which was right in the middle of all that. And so that's, and then now Mike and I live 3 blocks from all of that stuff. So our new townhouse is 3 blocks east of downtown. Since 2018, we lived in a house that was 4 blocks south of downtown. So all of it was walkable. And even when downtown was, had just a couple of restaurants and really that were mostly just like diners, one place that was pretty decent for lunch and salads and things, and a couple of, pretty mediocre to crappy bars. It was, I have a lot of friends here now and my office is here. And I immediately realized this is the most luxurious lifestyle I have had since college, because the ability to walk everywhere and just live your life on foot is luxurious. It's just delightful. Yeah. And my best friend now lives in our old house, lived a block away, and we got to be friends living in town here and living a block from each other. And we would just ride bikes, and there was a whole other crew of people. We'd ride bikes up the river in the evenings, and maybe stop for a beer or maybe not, and just enjoy the town. He really showed me just I smacked myself in the forehead one day when he talked about how nice it is to ride up the river during the sunset. I was like, wow, you mean you can just enjoy living in these walkable places? Because I'd always spent so much time trying to build them that I didn't spend much time just fucking enjoying it.
I know. It's a crazy thing. It's like it shouldn't be like a rarity or anything like that. It's we wish it was available to everybody, but it's wild when that was the thing about like living in Savannah, and that was like the hard part about leaving Savannah was, I think for a lot of us who have our ideals about walkability and everything, you kind of go back and forth about, do I want to spend my time, working real hard and trying to create this as much as I can and live in a certain place where I guess have the economic opportunity to do that? Or do you also maybe just say, at a certain point, screw it, I just want to live somewhere where I can be, do the things that I talk about all the time. So
yeah, exactly. And it is hard to live in a place that's already kicking butt.
Yeah.
And do the things that to make a place kick butt. So
yeah, and in so many of these places, the places that we admire, and if you didn't get in early, you can't afford it, at a certain point anymore. Anyway, so it's kind of a crazy deal. So as an architect, then with the infill projects, I know you worked with Eric and Mike and some others, but do you do any sketching or work on any of these is it a collaborative deal, or do you at this point just be like, well, I'm going to be a good client and be kind of hands off and just help direct my architects?
I'm trying very hard to just be a good client and direct my architects. I'll let you ask Eric on whether I'm a good client or not, but that's probably been the project where I have been the most, I've left the most to the architects on the design side. On the commercial building that I owned by myself was a building that didn't have any windows, 2 stories right on one of our main streets on a corner. So two full facades with essentially no windows, and it needed new windows, storefront and upstairs. So it basically just needed a whole facade because it was just a big windowless bunker. And but it had existing structural columns or structural considerations for where I could put windows, and it ended up being an interesting a challenging facade composition project. But anyway, I designed that building. And also it was a double high space where the second floor was just a mezzanine, and we closed in the second floor to make it into a mixed use building. So because it had always been a nightclub or restaurant, and it was too big as being a story and a half for this market to support, because the upstairs was just kind of, just sucked. So I was like, this needs to just be a regular size restaurant on the ground floor and then offices above. So I did the architecture on that, including the build out for the restaurant. I had some help on that on the layout, but I did the design, interior design stuff on that. I wish I had, I love the facade design process. And that was a really fun project, and the result was, it's unusual because of the constraints that it had. So, but I think it's a good result. But if I were doing more projects, I really feel like I don't do architecture every day. So I'm not, certainly I'm not going to do construction drawings, because I don't have that capability, just because I have the technical ability to do it. And I am now licensed. I could sign and seal it, but I don't want to. And I haven't signed and sealed anything yet. So my goal is to be more of a client than I am an architect.
So in all this stuff, and going back to even your initial work with Longleaf and others, you've obviously, tried to create well-designed places and beautiful places. Like what I know you said you had some thoughts kind of based on one of the other podcasts I had where we were going back and forth and talking about beauty in buildings and the value of that versus sort of utilitarian values as well. How have you tried to balance all that and really create beauty? And do you find it at conflict with also making real estate work?
I don't find beauty in conflict with making real estate work at all. I think it's critical. I don't think that things have to be built expensively in order to be beautiful. And my comment to you in my email was about y'all had a discussion on this, your podcast before last, about, and you'd said you can't legislate beauty. No amount of code in the world is going to result in beauty. And I've always thought about that, because I agree with you that codes by their nature don't result in beauty. That human love results in beauty. That's, because it's a spiritual outcome, not it's an outcome of the spirit. I don't mean that in metaphysical terms, but it's something that comes from a level of care that doesn't happen from just conformance.
Yeah. It's a value you bring to a project, basically.
Yeah.
Something you really care to do. Yeah.
Yes. That said, the American Vignoli and Vignoli, right? Mm-hmm. And other handbooks that were used by builders, not by architects, but by people who were just building buildings and designing and building buildings by hand in the 1800s and early 1900s, resulted in scads of what we consider beautiful buildings with a capital B, because it codified, maybe not in the sense of regulation, but in the sense of aspiration and guidance. It codified a way to arrive at competence with beautiful principles underlying it. And I wonder, it's a hypothesis. I've not proved it or even set out to prove it. But if you could require that people follow the American Vignoli as an example, or something else like that, where the principles of proportion are codified and they're followable, then I think you probably would still have to have some coaching, but I think you would get a whole lot closer than you can in because it's more like a playbook than it is a rule book
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
producing a competent design, competent in the classical sense.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's more like coaching people about um people who care. If you want to do good things, here are simple rules and patterns to follow that are not going to get you the Parthenon necessarily, but they're going to get
Right.
you certainly at a minimum like a B building, like a B or a B minus building, if you follow
Yeah.
these rules. And if you do them really well and execute the details well, you could end up with an A plus building.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah. And it's something that McKim, Mead, and White can follow that and come up with
right.
something spectacular, but the same underlying principles are in every garden variety inline building on a street, because individual urban buildings and places that we love are individually not spectacular. It's the accumulation of B buildings that are singing in the same key
Yeah.
that makes a good chorus.
Yeah.
Not everything can be a soloist anyway.
And certainly, a lot of the people who produced the buildings in that era that you described, late 19th, early 20th century. I mean, there were a whole lot of just like illiterate immigrants to
Yeah.
the United States who were the ones who were building all that, um, and
Yeah.
they didn't need 200 pages of construction drawings to follow it, but they did have patterns and illustrations and guides that they could follow. And just some
And
kind of
also
basic
a general
standards.
cultural agreement
Yeah.
on what looks good and what doesn't.
Right.
And that's what I think you can't recreate from start. I mean, from scratch, because
Right.
that culture builds up and accumulates over decades and generations of practice. Um,
No doubt. No doubt. Have you seen with the buildings that you have done in Newport Richey? Have there been other people who've looked at what you've done and tried to essentially say, kind of continue to raise the bar with good looking buildings?
Unfortunately, I can't say that has happened yet. There hasn't been that much new construction in Newport Richey, and I can't think of any off the top of my head that have been done since we built the Central, for example, which is really the only new ground up
Okay.
build. There's another apartment project and apartments and mixed use downtown, but it was designed in 2006 and then it was stalled, and it finished about the same time we did, but it has nothing, it didn't follow ours at all. We did have a lot of people, uh, and this is something I would recommend, which I did accidentally. I didn't put really good drawings of the buildings into the public before they were built. I made now here's a blunder. My blunder was I allowed the elevations of the buildings to be the first thing that got into the public view,
Hmm.
because they were required as part of the permitting process. And an elevation drawing of a building is the architectural equivalent of a mugshot. It's representative and it's accurate, but it's not representative. So it doesn't show you what a person looks like. It shows you just facts about their face.
Yeah.
And so it shows you facts about a building, but not what it's going to look like. So people saw the elevations of what Eric could design, which were intentionally very simple rectangular boxes, with regular, very competent, beautiful classical facades, but they look really flat, they look really boxy, and they look terrible. You couldn't see, it's elevation, there's no depth on it. So people were like, holy shit, of course he's building. I mean, they look like barracks.
Yeah.
And so people lost their minds. I'm like, oh, wait. So we quickly put together some 3D renderings based on a quick SketchUp model. We illustrated the hell out of them with landscaping and showed what a view down the street would look like. And it was a much better view. And that's really how you perceive the buildings. And so people were like, oh, okay, well, if it looks like that, I guess I won't oppose it so much. But they were still rightfully skeptical. And so I shouldn't, yes, do not let the first thing that people see of your buildings be an elevation drawing.
Yeah.
But the renderings that we put together were not very detailed, and they didn't show how refined the buildings are and how much architectural detail and character they have to them. And I didn't because I just didn't have time to model it. I was just like, get something out there that just kind of, the buildings really, this is about the space of the street and the landscaping and the view to the lake and all that. Once the buildings were built, we had people stop us in the street and say, man, I was opposed to this at the beginning, but this is so beautiful. Thank you for building this. I love it. It's great. And and that was the goal. And we really were intending to not make them spectacular buildings, but really nice buildings that really brought out a nice moment in the urban design. So they wrap around the lake, and then Central Avenue is a street that takes off from the lake or terminates in the lake. And so we have towers on the two corners that kind of mark that entry to Central Avenue, and then buildings that mirror each other across Central. It's very formal and competent, but it's not overbearing. And the buildings are up to the street, the parking's in the back. So urbanistically, they're doing what they need to do. And which also, that's one of those things that if you describe to people, they don't really get it. But if you show it to them and they see, and you say, this could have been parking here instead of a building, then they understand, oh yeah, that's really nice.
Yeah, no doubt. So after all of this, do you recommend the path of architect as developer to other people, especially young people?
Yeah, if you've got an architecture degree, you've got a great basis for development. A funny story, when I was in college, I had a friend who was in one of the student ministries that I was involved with, who wanted to become she was studying linguistics, and she wanted to go work for Wycliffe Bible translators and go work with some, obscure people group and discover their lexicon and translate the Bible. That's what Wycliffe Bible translators do. And there were some folks who lived in the area who did exactly that. And they had been architecture students at Rice. And so we went to their house for dinner, and they told us about their path of how they got into translating the Bible. They worked with some little people group in Papua New Guinea that had like 200 people who were all the only people on the planet who spoke this dialect of this language. And their task was to learn their language, not get killed, learn their language, develop a lexicon of their language, and then use that to translate the Bible into their language. So and they described that as a multi-level problem-solving task, for which their architecture degrees had perfectly prepared them. And so they described architecture as a multi-level problem-solving task, right? You have to you're everything from beauty to plumbing, structure, construction, durability, all of those things that Vitruvius told us about. You're solving for all of those things with one solution. So the ability to think and solve a problem on multiple dimensions at the same time is a great skill for life, whatever you're going to do. And I tell people who want to go into architecture, do it, because even if you don't end up as an architect, it's still a great preparation for a lot of different things you could do, from translating the Bible to, technology things and real estate development. So real estate development is definitely a generalist pursuit. I know a lot about a lot of things. I'm not I'm more than just a jack of all trades, but I'm certainly not a master of many. But it's helpful to, I know a lot about drainage. I know a lot about regional planning. I know a lot about how codes work and how planning works, and politics and things like that. There are a lot of things that architecture school doesn't do a good job of teaching in terms of teamwork and people management, both of of working with other people and managing teams. That's something that most people will have to pick up as a skill. from architecture school. But if you're an architect and you want to become a developer, I say go do it.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. That's a great explanation. So, all right, Frank, we should probably wrap it here.
All right.
This has been really cool. And for me, especially, I love these chances to get to know people better that I've known for a little while anyway. So
yeah, Kevin, I feel like we've always known each other and we've had a lot of mutual friends, but we've never just sat down and talked to this kind of length. So I've enjoyed it too. Yeah. Sometime I'd like to interview you the other way around. Although I'm picking up a lot by listening to your podcast, which I really do enjoy it. So I'll put a shout out.
You can turn the table anytime you want. That'd be fine. So
okay.
All right, I appreciate it.
And one of these days, I'd like to come see you in Kansas City and see what you're doing out there.
Yeah, please do. I would love your feedback on some of the things that I'm doing and others that I'd like to do. And, we all have kind of a different path of what we're doing, but we have a lot of similar goals and ideals. So
yeah,
it's always interesting to see how different people are working in whatever they're doing. So
yeah, absolutely. You've got a fun job doing a podcast. So good for you. And you're doing a good job getting a lot of voices out here in addition to your own.
Yeah, I enjoy it. It's been, I think this one might be number 50 with you that I'll release.
Wow.
And so that feels like, I'm hitting a milestone where it feels like it's a real thing now. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. So. Very good.
All right, Frank. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Kevin. Have a great week.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.